A few months ago, I was contacted by someone from the Queen Mary University of London from their Artificial Intelligence and Music Research Programme. And they asked me if I was willing to give a seminar on the Zettelkasten note-taking method. And I thought this was a great fit for the teaching that I put out on YouTube to connect with students about the challenges that they have and really showcase where the Zettelkasten method is great for those kind of research programs. And this video here is essentially a playback now of that session. It's in two parts. This one is the Zettelkasten note-taking method as a high-level kind of presentation. And then there's a follow-on video where we do some practical hands-on with the Obsidian note-taking app. Now, a lot of work has gone into this, and I do plan to sell the high-quality version with a re-recording with great audio and deliver the PDF on atomicnotetaking.com. So if that's of interest to you, go over to there and you can drop your email in and get on the waitlist. I am also preparing an ebook on Obsidian advanced techniques and the Zettelkasten note-taking method, which I'll also be offering on there as well. So that might also be of interest. Now, if you are a university and would consider wanting this for your own students and your own research program, then do reach out to me on hello@meda.io, and there I'll be able to answer any questions about what that may look like and any pricing to do with that. But without further ado, let's get into this presentation and enjoy.
So yeah, we're talking about Zettelkasten. This is the outline of what we're going to be doing today. I'll give a bit of an introduction about myself, how I came to be here today. We're going to look at different types of projects and see that relates to the work that you'll be doing. I'll introduce the Zettelkasten, so if you're not familiar, don't worry, we'll be through it, that's the whole point. Look at some of the benefits, look at some of the challenges. We'll probably break about there, and then when we come back, we'll actually look into a software called Obsidian. So raise your hand if you've heard or used of Obsidian, so more people look there. So we'll be going through some techniques. If you've not used it before, then it'll be a good introduction. And then we'll look at how you can apply the Zettelkasten in Obsidian. So hopefully you get a picture of where the two come together and you'll be able to make use of it. So we'll start with the introduction. So my name is Martin Adams. I call myself a tech entrepreneur and a YouTube educator. So there are my links if you wanted to explore that more. And I'll give you a bit of a background of how I got into this and how I came here today. So yeah, how did I come to be a Zettelkasten teacher? I did not plan for this, but it started many years ago when I fell in love with audiobooks. If you're not into audiobooks, I highly recommend it. In my lifetime, I have listened to over 1 month and 22 days of audiobooks. That's a lot of content, but with audio, it's sometimes in one ear and out the other one. So at the same time, I love creating YouTube videos. It's something I took a bit more seriously in 2016, stopped, and then in the last 18 months picked it up again. And I had this frustration. I had all these ideas, but I wanted to create content, and I couldn't recall all the great ideas into making great storytelling, great output. And that's when in 2020, I think, I discovered the Zettelkasten. I read this book, How to Take Smart Notes by Sonke Ahrens. And it was an interesting book. And I got about halfway through when it clicked. Like, I get it now. And that's when everything changed. So this allowed me then to refocus my YouTube channel at teaching what I've discovered. And that also helps me learn. So the questions I get back from people who watch the videos helps me understand where the challenges are. And that's how Kerry discovered me on YouTube and said, hey, I can see some potential here. Why don't you come and give a seminar at the university? And that's how I'm here. So yeah, basically you're being taught by a YouTuber right now, so good luck. So let's think about projects. And there are two types of projects really, top down and bottom up. And well, I say there are two types, there's actually 4 types of projects. So there's this grid. I actually love this because I start questioning the kinds of things I'm working on, and I say, what kind of project is this? And if you think of this grid in terms of 2 axes, some of them, you know where you're going, you know what you want to do. But then at the top there, top left, you just don't know how to get there. Or you might know how to get there and you know what you want to do, or you don't know where you're going and you don't know how to get there, or you don't know where you're going, but you do know how to get there. So there's these 4 types, and I'll explain what this means. If you know where you're going, but you don't know how to get there, you're on a quest. So if you think of a quest, you've got a mission to do, but the road to do it is treacherous. You don't know what dragons you're going to need to slay. You don't know what those challenges are. You have to figure it out as you go along, but you know why you're doing it. And that's what we call a quest project. At the other end, you might know where you're going, but you don't know what the ending is. You don't know where you're going. That's a movie. You watch a movie, and the plot goes, and you're like, I understand where this plot's going, like what's happening, but what's going to happen at the end? I don't know. So that's what we call a movie project. If you're in one of these projects, you're probably in a good place to some degree. Then you have the paint by numbers. I know what I'm doing, and I know where I'm going. So it's pretty much all dictated. You just got to follow the motions. And if you're really unlucky, you're in a fog project. I don't know where I'm going, and I don't know how to get there. So if you find yourself in a fog project, you need to do something. You need to transition yourself to one of the other quadrants, and you have to figure that out. So let's think of your education at the moment. If you're an undergrad, which for the record, I've only done an undergrad degree, so you guys are a lot smarter than me, but you pretty much know where you're going. They tell you what to do, and they tell you how to do it, and you do it. So in that sense, you know what the problem is, and you know how to solve it. Nice and simple. If you're doing a master's, they might tell you what the problem is, but they don't tell you how to do it. So it's a quest. I know where I want to get to. Now I've got to figure out the road to get there. Anyone doing a PhD here? Unlucky. You don't know what the problem is, and you don't know how to get there. So what do? You need to transition yourself to one of the other quadrants. You can choose to go up to a quest and say, let's pick where I want to get to. And then I'll figure out the steps along the way. And that's moving up to a quest. And then, as you figure out those steps, you move it over to a paint by numbers. And that allows you to then do the work that actually fulfills that quest. Or you could go the other way. Or if you go that way, that's a top-down approach. So you find the problem first, and then you figure out how to solve it. Or you can go the other way. You can say, let's figure out what I can solve, and then figure out where that's going to go. And that's the movie project. And that's bottom up. So you find solutions, and then you find what problem those solutions fit. And that's what we call bottom up. So let's think about the kind of problems that you will face as a PhD student. So don't ask me where I got this from, but I pulled this off the internet somewhere, and I thought it was quite fitting. As a PhD student, you need to produce a significant, independent, and novel body of work. So an example, that could be a thesis, but any kind of publication, that contributes to new knowledge to a particular research topic. Hopefully that sounds in line with what you're experiencing. So let's break that down. When we talk about produce, you've got to create something. So you can't have all the theory and never create something. It's got to be significant. So you've got to have deep understanding of the thing you're creating. Independent. It's got to be your own personal understanding, your own journey. So if you are doing a quest, it's you doing that quest. It's got to be novel. Can't do what other people have done. So you've got to have original thought. You've got to produce a body of work. So that involves some kind of structured writing, some kind of output that allows you to create out of that. It's got to contribute. In other words, it's all well doing that, but you're going to look to publish that so others can build on what you've discovered and what you've contributed. So you have to think about how you're going to publish that. It's got to have new knowledge, so the insights and discoveries that you have along the way that other people have missed. And a particular research topic. So that's your material, that's your baseline, that's your field of interest that you want to base it on. So when we think of all of this, we can start to put down some kind of hierarchy. That you're going to publish something, You're going to publish it through some kind of structured writing. To do that, you've got to create something that comes from original thoughts and your insights. To do that, you have to have that deep understanding, and you've got to research your material. You've got to do your research. And if you think of it like that, all the way at the top, you've got your publication, and all the way at the bottom, you've got your research. And you can think of that, if we go back to the quest analogy, as a top-down. I want to publish something in this field, with this idea, and now we've got to figure out how to do that along the way. And that's top-down. So let's do an analogy here. And we use ChatGPT. So I'm very lazy, and I don't really know an awful lot about, well, I know enough to play with AI, but the detail, I don't know. So I use ChatGPT to produce examples. I don't read too much into them. They will probably be gibberish when you get. But it looks smart to me, so I'm very happy. So imagine you've got some publication, and you're using the top down. So you think of like, my end goal is to produce that. And I came up with an idea of, let's say you've got something in the metaverse, some kind of VR, and you want to apply some kind of dynamic music based on the people's moods in VR, like something like that. Sounds fancy enough to work with an example. So you come up with that idea, and that's the thing I want to now research and find the gaps and all of that. So to do that, you think of the topic that interests you. Usually, when you're interested in the topic, it's much easier to learn around it. If it doesn't interest you, it's going to be really hard. So you think of things that interest you, and you start asking questions. So you might ask, what factors influence music modulation in VR? Does any individual have a stronger impact on such cues than someone else? How do you dynamically modulate music? Probably fundamental questions. How do you measure those cues, and what music modulations desired to produce the emotional states that you want? So these could be big, open-ended questions that you don't know what's going to happen next as you explore it. So you start doing your literature review. You start reading around. You start discovering what's already out there to continue that thought process. So you might have lots of ideas that suddenly come to mind. You might ask yourself, the what-if questions. So you read something, what if this wasn't true? What if this other thing happened? You start exploring that, and that gives you some of your original thought. And then you think, can I apply this and this, like in the example? Can I apply changing music to VR? What does that look like? And you start exploring across. And you start to imagine those gaps. So as you're doing your literature review, you have to start thinking wider than what you're reading in front of you. And once you've got these kind of questions, you start exploring them. You go off into the different areas and start pulling in new research that helps you fill in those gaps that maybe weren't in the context of your original kind of idea. And as you do that, you start asking, okay, has this been done before? Who's done it before? What material is there that I can research? And if it hasn't been done before, is that something I can find as a gap that I can add my novel insight to? Did I miss one? And then you're asking that question, could this be the thing that's my original contribution? Have I stumbled on something here? And once you have those ideas, once you find something that, this could be the novelty, this could be the original thing, you conduct your research. And in your case, I presume that might be some kind of algorithm to test something out, prototype, those kinds of things. And once you do that, you figure out, did it actually yield any positive results? What were my results? Did it prove what I thought it was going to do, or does it show that actually this is not going to yield any results? And then you write your paper. So you've done all your research, you've got everything, now you've got something to publish back out. The top-down approach is hard. So you start with the idea and you start filling in the gaps and you come down to the bottom. It's hard. Because sometimes you're thinking, where do I start? You're looking at a piece of paper and you think, what questions should I ask? And all of that. In the work that I do, create content online, blog posts, things like that. And if you start with, I want to write a blog post on something, and if the first thing you're doing is trying to write the article, it's really hard. You can't recall all the things that you want to put in at that moment. Sometimes it's hard to know what questions to ask because you sort of have to follow the thread before the questions present themselves. And it's a concept of building the track as you go. I want to write the paper, but I have to now lay the next layer. I have to figure out what topic, I have to figure out what research. And you're doing it as you go. And when you do that, you're sort of mixing your research, your thinking, your insights, and you're writing all in one go. And that can be hard. So if we think of it as a workflow, let's say we start with the research material, and you want to make some kind of personal understanding of that. You're making your notes. You're not reading someone else's notes, because that doesn't really work, because it's going to come from you. So you get your deep understanding of that. And then you want to gain those insights. As you understand it, you want to start thinking, what does this mean? What questions am I asking? And then you might find that you've got some original thoughts. And you obviously explore that, make sure that they are genuinely original. And when you get to that point, you want to create something through the structured writing and publish your findings. And I'll put that green arrow there because what you publish is the foundation for the next person to go around the cycle in the future. And that's your contribution back to the bigger picture. So when you think of that as a workflow, you'll notice that I started with the research and went round. And that's essentially going to be doing the bottom up. So you may be asking, okay, how do we create this workflow? Now, before I carry on, I want to ask questions. Anyone want to volunteer their approach to what I said there? Because I've not done a PhD. I have no idea whether that's like what you do. So there's your opportunity to tell me if that's accurate or way off. Anyone want to volunteer?
So what I found so far is that it tends to be a bit mixed because obviously you have a research proposal, so you have a vague general idea of like what you're aiming for. But what I found so far that happens that normally you start moving in that direction and then you find a specific sub-problem that you find like challenging or interesting or that there's something, and then to that problem you apply a slightly more bottom-up approach because you start kind of like exploring the pieces of it. So you've got like an overarching direction, but the kind of like micro workflow is a little bit more bottom-up.
Yeah. Before we move on, I want to ask, how do you make your notes? Anyone volunteer their technique for note making? Obviously some of you do Zettelkasten, so that might be. Anyone?
Am I the only one who's...
Okay, right, so notes optional. Have you heard of Cornell method, outline method, things like that? Have you come across those? Where do you store your notes? Obviously you use paper.
None.
Any volunteers? Where do you store your notes?
Well, I kind of use Zettelkasten, but I use a different software. I use Settler instead of Obsidian.
Any other takers? Yeah.
Before using Obsidian, I was using a folder with countless Google documents and Word documents and chaos and tiers and stuff like that.
Mind if I ask, how many times did you go back to those notes?
No.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I did a bit of combo of paper and on my laptop. So if it's like a fleeting thought where I just need to like understand something that I've like read, I'll tend to write it down until I'm like, oh, okay, I clearly get it now. Okay. But if it's like a permanent note that I need to refer back to, or I'm like taking notes from something, it goes onto like Obsidian or something like that.
Great. You use a couple of words there that are very interesting. You've definitely heard the Zettelkasten.
Oh.
Fleeting and permanent, we'll come across those. From my own experience, notes would just collect and then collect dust. It's that recency thing. As I make the notes, I think I get it, but do I have the energy to go back to it later rather than sort of, making it up as I go along? So the question, how do we create a workflow that is this bottom up? And the answer is, you'll probably guess it, that's our point of the talk, Zettelkasten. So let's go into what this is. So it started with this person called Nicholas Luhmann, born in 1927 to 1998. And he was a German sociologist, and he basically devised a system of recording his thinking in note form. And when he created this system, he managed to create 70 books and over 400 scholarly articles. And even so much so that even after he passed, his colleagues could take his body of work and continue his thinking in published form. So it was that well constructed that it actually contributed without him. And his area of interest were topics ranging from law, economy and politics to art, religion and love. So there's no particular scoping of which this lends itself towards. And in his Zettelkasten, he had over 90,000 notes. That's quite a lot. So how he managed that is quite impressive. So it starts with a very simple concept. He wasn't using a digital form, and there are some practitioners of Zettelkasten who still insist on using paper form, which is fine. I'm not one of them, but it's fine. So he would write these notes on an index card, so a very small piece of paper, not sheets and sheets. And he would call that a zettel. So it's a single note. And the idea here is that each note contained one atomic idea. And when I talk about atomic idea, it essentially means it's got to be self-contained and not kind of meandering multiple ideas in one thing, just one atomic idea. Each note would be given their own ID. Now, he's using a paper form, so that's quite critical, otherwise he'll never find them again. If you're using digital forms, it's a little bit easier to find things again. But most importantly, he would then relate a note to other notes of interest, and he would then reference those in his notes. And the core concept is that if you were to take any note out of the Zettelkasten and read it, it should make sense. It shouldn't be something that, oh, I need to read 20 more notes to just understand what this is on about. It's got to be something that we read in isolation and still make sense. And the act of doing that is where the value comes in, because that doesn't happen by default. If you write notes today, don't do anything with it and look at it in 6 months' time, chances are you might have lost a bit of context as to what you were thinking at that time and why it made sense to you then and what's lost about it now. Once he created these notes, he would store them in a physical filing cabinet, which we call the Zettelkasten. And to get them in there, he would start, so let's say he's reading something, he's doing his research. He would create these notes, which are very short kind of memory joggers of what he's thinking at that time, what comes to mind. He'd create those, very condensed form, that reading. He's not copying paragraphs, he's not taking a lot of that body, he's trying to make it as small as possible. And then at the end of the day, he would take those notes and he would create these atomic notes from his day's reading. And that allows him to truly understand the meaning and the understanding of what he's read, because he's gone through condensing it, and now he's got to expand it back out into his thinking. And if he doesn't understand it, he has to go back and question why he doesn't understand it. By doing that, he's not sort of copying and getting just the recognition. When you read something, you recognize, yeah, that makes sense, but then ask out the blue, no, explain why it makes sense. You're like, I don't know why it makes sense. I haven't got the words to articulate why I know it makes sense yet. And that's what it helps him achieve. And then he'd take these notes and he'd create new notes again, but this time, this is to update his slipbox. This time, he would pull existing notes out of his slipbox, the Zettelkasten, and he'd start looking at it in that context, and he'd say, what does this mean in terms of the other things that I understand that I've made notes on? What does it relate to? Does it counteract it? Does it enhance my understanding? Is it the same thing? And only then would he then put it back into his filing system. So we're looking at this workflow, and we end up with 3 distinct note types. And this is where we have the fleeting notes, we have the literature notes, and we have the permanent notes. And the important thing is permanent notes are in the context of the Zettelkasten, and the literature notes are in the context of the reading material.
Well, I'd just like to ask you a question, which may not be completely apropos, but if he had 90,000 notes, and so he's going through this process where he writes, jots down an idea, which is a fleeting note, and then he reworks it in his own words into an atomic note or a literature note. And then he's going to look through his slip box of 90,000 notes to find the ones that are wrote. How do you think he did that?
I think he was a machine, to be honest. That's a really good question. I think he must have had some really smart organisation techniques, which we'll cover a little bit, of how he found his way through his system. Because physical note system has to be organised in a way that you can't just have things randomly. What he did do is he had a numbering system, so he could insert notes at the right place to kind of continue that thought process.
Kind of like a Dewey Decimal type of
Yeah, it's called the full gazettal, and it's, you start with the number 1, 2, 3, and then it's 1A, 1B, 1C, like alternating numbers and characters. And then that allows you to basically get a tree version of, I can insert here and derive its order in the big scheme of things. It's a good question. I don't know the specifics of his actual workflow, but
well,
it's
obviously
fascinating.
Obsidian with all the search functionality, it becomes much easier.
It much easier on a computer, okay, so when we think of the Zettelkasten, we can think of it both as a system and a workflow. So the system is how it exists in a given state, and the workflow is how you interact with it. Any questions so far on what I've... Yes?
Yes, so there are 4 types of notes. Fleeting notes, literature notes, permanent notes, 3 types of notes, right?
Yes.
Right. So how does it work again? These literature, are they permanent, or are they supposed to be deleted? The fleeting notes, I guess you have to get rid of them, otherwise.
Good question. It depends if you're a note hoarder or not. Do you like to collect things? Personally, I like the idea of a workflow. So if I have a fleeting note and I've processed that into creating my literature notes, I'll just archive it off, but I can link it back so I know where that note came from, I know what text I read it from. So you're getting that kind of audit trail of that thinking. Literature notes, imagine, this is the sort of aha moment. The difference between a literature note and a permanent note is a literature note, I can take one book and I can create literature notes from it. And it will be my understanding of that book, just that one book. I may not agree with it, and I may have notes about that book that I don't disagree, but what I don't do is start thinking about why I disagree based on other literature that I've read. So it's in the context of that one source material. And only when you transfer that from a literature to a permanent note, you're pulling in all the books that you've read, all the material, and you're starting to make that bigger understanding. If you're just creating your first system, you haven't got anything in your permanent notes, so they look the same. It's only over time that the connections in the permanent notes get more varied and specific to the other things you've read. So yeah, that's the subtle distinction. And how I like to think of literature notes as my work in progress. So I've read a book, I've got my literature notes, and now them on their own is waiting to be thought about in the Zettelkasten, and that's like another phase of your workflow.
So I just wanted to say that the way I've been doing it, and I don't know if this is right or not, is that my fleeting notes, when they become literature notes, it's in place. So the fleeting note actually transforms into a literature note, and it doesn't exist as a fleeting note.
So you get to edit the original notes.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I take the original note, which is just capturing or jotting down that, I got an idea, and I don't want to lose that, and I jot it down. Then later on, when I convert that into a literature note, well, I'm just editing the original fleeting note, and I tag them.
Yeah.
The fleeting notes, because I want to make sure I go back and get all the fleeting notes, so I tag them as fleeting notes. And then later on, when I've edited it, I change the tag into a literature note. And then later on, after I've gone through and I've linked, I then change it at the tag to permanent note. So then I know what to do in my workflow. I know where to find the things I need to be working on as part of the process.
So I probably should have said this. There are only multiple right ways of doing this, and whatever works for you is the right way if it works for you. There are obviously wrong ways of doing things because you'll find that it actually doesn't serve you in the right way. So what I tell you today, don't feel like you've got to do it like that. There will be workflows. So that's a really good example where keeping a body of things that have gone in the past may not be that relevant, and actually mutating that note through its journey, perfectly valid. There was one thing that you want to take, the essence of this is atomic ideas, atomic notes, and how you link them together. And we'll go into more detail on that. Though, if there's one thing I want you to get right, it's that part, because that's where the real benefits come. But how you get there, do what feels right. There's no, you watch another YouTuber about Zettelkasten, you'll get a completely different take on it. So there is no official right way of doing it, just an interpretation. Okay, so let's think about connected thinking. Trying to think. There's a few phrases going, that are kind of buzzwords at the moment in this space, like second brain, connected thinking, tools for thought. If you're going to go on YouTube or something and look, you'll sort of see these. And they sort of all relate. And the concept here is that you'll create these atomic notes, and you might have one kind of understanding of a concept, which builds onto the next one and the next one. So you create this kind of continuation of thoughts. Some of the questions I get back on YouTube are like, how do I take notes on a textbook when it's like one big kind of, this, and so just break it down, just so you can pull one out and just that one little bit. And yeah, it's fine that they build on each other. You're just creating that continuation through the links. And I call that sequence. There's no particular naming for it, but you're just creating a sequence of those thoughts. But at the same time, you might be thinking, what other notes are in my Zettelkasten that this is sort of related to that I'm interested in? And so you can imagine those elsewhere. And then you can draw those links together. So if you think of it as these are all the parts of your understanding, and you've got it in the Zettelkasten, and you've got them in a way that's small atomic notes, and you can create these links between them. This is where the magic happens. So everybody pay attention. You might come up with a thought. That could be an idea, an insight. It's like, oh, there's something here that nobody else has really thought of. Could just be a question like, what if? Or, why does that happen? It could just be an observation. As I read my books, I usually have observations and questions, and I put those in if I'm reading a particular book, Kindle notes. And that's a prompt for me to go and create some further, like looking at the gaps and where that relates. And then you create a new note for that question, that insight, and you put it down. Ask the question, why is this important to you? And that becomes something that you can build on. And if you think of the notes around the outside, those are the parts of your thinking. But the sum of all the parts is greater than the parts. You've got something bigger that the original text never had. Which is very hard if you just create notes in a lecture or in a book and try and refer to that as you sort of do your research. You've got to do those questions, you've got to explore it. And those new notes become notes in your Zettelkasten that then you can build on, you can link to, and you can continue that journey and connect that to maybe something completely different. One of the concepts I absolutely love is a polymath. Someone who takes one discipline and another discipline and just basically merges them and finds something that people aren't thinking of. And it's in the business world, it's generally considered a bit of a superpower that if you can take a particular discipline and apply it to a business that is old school, then that's how you disrupt. So this helps. Any questions on that so far before I kind of move on? The idea of creating new notes to capture your thinking, your ideas.
Just to make sure, the atomic notes are this kind of like midway between a literature note and a note in the Zettelkasten.
So your literature notes should be atomic. If your literature notes are, if I can't pick up a literature note that you've written, read it out loud and make sense of it, then I'll give it back to you and say, keep working on it. Did that answer your question? Or
okay.
In terms of the atomicity, I find, for example, that especially when it comes to you working with math-related stuff, many times you can have something that looks atomic in the sense that might be a theorem or like a particular derivation, but it's not fully atomic in the sense that like you're still need, like, if I say, I don't know, like, V is a sub-level space of whatever, like, that still needs to refer to some kind of other node of what a sub-level space is, even if I'm, let's say, like, using it in shorthand. So where is the limit between that? Because many times I find myself, like, doubting to, let's say, repeat myself for the sake of clarity in a single node, or if to, like, separate things in different nodes and refer back to them.
So ultimately find a workflow that works best for you. If you're repeating, it's really hard to update your understanding. I mean, okay, maybe in a mathematical answer, it's probably not going to update very frequently, but if it's something more conceptual where you sort of copied and just inserted to get a bit more context in a note, that's harder to update because you've got to find all the references where you sort of repeated that. Personally, what I would do is I would just create a separate note of that explanation. It can be short, doesn't really matter, and just link it in. I'll show you the linking so you get a feel for that. And there are some techniques in Obsidian where you can actually preview the content of it in the note. So it's still a link, you're just exposing it at that bigger level. So you've got this system of notes, and let's say we wanted to draw, if you've used Obsidian and seen the graph, you know where this is going. If you haven't, imagine a note. Number of connections means that note gets bigger as a blob on a graph. So the more connections it has, the bigger, it's like you start getting a cluster of understanding there. And you can think of it as a sort of a graph of these things are connected to those things. I use Midjourney to generate that, so it's more artistic than real, but it illustrates the bigger the blob, the more connections it has, the smaller the blob, the more sort of isolated that thought is, and maybe it's not as relevant, or you just haven't explored it in enough detail. So when you have this sort of view, which is really hard to do if you've got long form notes and it's not atomic, you can't really see where the connections are because it's just big bodies of text and you're not doing the linking. You can start to see these clusters, and depending on the kind of work you're doing, you can start to see where that understanding is forming, where you're strongest in your understanding, but also where it has led you to as well. And then you can start thinking, well, these clusters have very little to do with each other. There's very few connections. What if I did try and merge them more? What happens if I start connecting things together? Which I think is quite a compelling thought process, because that's how you get these kind of original thinking. Just on a slight tangent, I had an idea about like information over time. There's very much like, if you want to create an original idea, DNA has a really good way of doing that. In a sense, you have two ways of creating a new generation. You can either take two isolated parts of the gene pool and put them together, which is what those clusters could be doing. Or you can take one of those and actually introduce mutations and see what happens. So asking your what if questions is the mutations, and taking clusters is when you're pairing that DNA together and creating something that's never been done before. I find that really exciting. It's a nice way to, it's exactly what machine learning does, is it tries all the things until it gets something that's useful. And then you can assemble projects out of this. So we're thinking bottom up. You've got all your understanding and your insights, and maybe some results of some research that you've been doing that's showing really good. So rather than looking at that blank sheet of paper as a starting point for writing what you're going to output, you start just by linking in all the things that you want to cover. And it becomes the building block of your output, what you're going to create. So really, the writing part should be probably the most boring part, because you've done all the exciting things and now you just put in the fancy words around it, right? That's the theory. Especially if I was writing a blog post, it should be as simple as, I don't need to do any thinking here. I just need to assemble the blocks, make it flow right, and the thing should kind of produce itself. Just on a slight tangent, if I were probably comparing more of the kind of blog writing world, you will be doing research in a Zettelkasten in lots of things. You could be starting to assemble multiple projects at the same time. They may not be ready to finish off and publish because you may be still going through it, but it doesn't have to be like one in, one out. So if you imagine you've got the kernels of popcorn and they're all heating up, that's your research, all these things, and as the ideas and the insights pop, that's when you can publish something. And they might pop like more frequently than if you're doing one, do all the research, publish, one, do all the research, publish. So that's the real benefit of Zettelkasten. And this, Nicholas Luhmann, he produced so much work out of it as a demonstration of its power. So we can think of that as a bottom up. You've got this whole knowledge base of which ideas and things can suddenly come out and emerge from. Your projects come from that Zettelkasten. And if you're doing a top down, your projects, they just lack all that insight. You don't have all this. You lack that understanding. You're thinking, I need this, and I've got a stack of books or papers to read, and I've got to do this thing in the middle. Whereas if you inverse it, do all the things, and then see what comes out of it. Okay, so that's kind of the introduction of Zettelkasten. I will be going into more detail about the specifics of what a node looks like, so don't worry. But let's think about those benefits. So if you were to compare like folders in a Google Drive or notes on a piece of paper, we'll see how that compares. So yeah, that's your glowing Zettelkasten. These are all Mid-Journey, by the way, if you hadn't guessed. I'm sure you probably recognize the style. So Zettelkasten, it's a fluid structure. You'll notice that I haven't spoken about folders, because there are no folders. There's no rigid categories. They're simple notes, because they're atomic. And anything can link to anything. So there's no bounds as to where you're constraining your thinking. A good example is if you try and put folders of, neuroscience in a particular folder and machine learning in another folder, and then you want to create something that's applying the two together, which folder do you put it in? The moment you categorize things is the moment you find that nothing fits. And Zettelkasten just allows you to be completely free-flowing with it. The linking helps your ideas start to emerge because you start to ask, it's a prompt for the questions. If you're reading all your notes and it's sort of verbatim of what you've read, you're not in thinking mode, you're in sort of like recognition mode, but you can start just pull two things. And this is what Nicholas Luhmann would do. He'd spend time going through his Zettelkasten, just pulling things out and thinking about it. He had no particular agenda, he's just exploring and seeing what happens. Which is great for the kind of research that you're doing, because you don't know where you're going. You need to let it emerge. So you can create these idea notes. You can create questions like what happens or why does that happen? You might have an insight and say, I think this could be related to something, or this could yield some benefit. Or you might disagree. You might say, the consensus says this, but I disagree because, and make a note, and that could be a prompt for exploring that further. The other benefit is it's an externalization of your thinking. So, what's the phrase? Our brains are having ideas, not storing them. I can't remember who said that, but and it's so true, because as we trust our brains more than we should. We have that feeling of recency. Oh, I'll remember that. No, you won't, because you've forgotten it in 10 minutes' time. You're thinking about something else. It's a very linear process, and unless you're actually consciously recalling things, chances are you'll probably start forgetting that you were working on something or remembering something. But this helps you put it out of your mind. And it's, if you can employ this even in other areas of your life, a system where you can trust your notes more. I need to remember someone's birthday, or all those little things. The more you can trust the system, the clearer your mind will be, and you're not getting stressed as it starts building up. Ooh. Which means to do your thinking, you have ideas, put them as notes. You have questions, put them as notes. You have thoughts, random fleeting thoughts, put them as notes, because they can lead to something. Your brain's telling you something. And the important thing here, by doing that, you start putting it through your own process of thinking. You start making sure that you do understand it, that it has your stamp on it, not someone else's, your stamp, because then you'll recall it easier and it'll be in your system. So when you read your notes later, it will make more sense. And a good technique is to think about, what does future me want out of this? And you might, if you ask that question, you say, well, I'm not going to remember that phrase, so maybe I'll just write some keywords and or something into the notes so that I know what I'm searching for. You know you best. Think about how you search for things and then make your life easier by make sure you do the groundwork now so you can find it again later. It's a good way to employ the Richard Feynman principle. So, for very high level, you note the things you know and you've read. This is kind of your going through your literature notes and putting that in there. Explain it as simply as you can as you're explaining it to a child. Good luck, because it's a very complex subject that you guys are working on. But at the same time, the simpler you do it, the easier it will be for you in the future. Note what you don't know. Don't leave gaps, don't kind of stop. Actually put them as things. I do not know this. And then plug those gaps. They become branches off in your Zettelkasten of things that you want to explore more. And you're obviously going to prioritize what you can explore. You can't research something all the way down to the atoms. There has to be a point where you've got to prioritize, but you'll get a feel for it. What's important and what you can just leave as, there's a level of unknown, but I don't need to know that. And then add it all to the Zettelkasten. So it sounds simple, right? Okay. So at this point, you're thinking, it's all very good, but a few questions. Almost to the point you just don't know what it really looks like now, moving forward. Before I go to the next slide, I've got some questions which I've been asked through my YouTube channel and elsewhere. So I've got a bit of an insight to the stumbling blocks. But before I go there, I promise you, any questions or things that you would like to explore in more detail, get more clarity. Yeah.
Based on the atomicity principle, my thought process is always recursive and suddenly it goes through chaos because you just try to reach the fundamentals of the process or the notions that you try to describe or understand. So based on the question about mathematics especially, you can just read the actions through a process, and so I can define an atomic simple node because everything collapses to the first principles. And so where can you just draw a line and say that's it? Or tactically, what you do?
It's a good question. One that's hard for me to really visualize not being in that field. The way I would think about it is at what point is it a problem for you to continue, and at what point does that problem go away? So if you find that there's a lot of work kind of going down to those first principles, and it's taking up, then maybe that's the problem, that you can't prioritize where your notes go. There's no reason why you can't put a placeholder and say, this is as far as I've got to. If it becomes a problem and I need it to explain something, that's the point I'll continue that thread. That's kind of how I would approach that. There's no right or wrong answer. It's what works for you, really. The things to look out for is try not to repeat yourself so that you're doing the work once. And yeah, if you need to use that note, does it give you sufficient context that you find yourself stumbling? And that's usually the prompt where, like, I need more detail here. But if you don't ever need it, then I've given this as a problem. Any other questions before I move on? Or observations or confusions or, yeah?
I'm just a little bit concerned that it requires some extra time to take these notes in a more structured way, right? It's like, that's the trade-off, you would say. I'm sure the benefits are, better, like, than the caveats, but yeah.
It is an upfront, but if your notes are your thinking, you have to ask yourself, where are you putting that time anyway? understanding something. And I guess you really want to use the tooling so it's not a chore, that it's from the quickest point of your thinking to typing. Then if you don't have to spend 10 minutes organising and thinking about it, maybe that's kind of not ideal. It depends if you want to kick the can down the road. If you create long form notes, yes, you're capturing that, and yes, you might find that's what you want. But you have to really make that call. Will I need to, like, how am I going to do my thinking around this? How am I going to create my ideas off this? When just even find the part in that note, I've got to now read an awful lot.
Yeah.
So experiment with it, trial and error. That's the. It's a good observation because, like, yeah, it's hard to know what you're investing in when you haven't got the benefits of it initially. And if you're up against the time, you've got other things that are priority, it's probably the first thing to slip in terms of best practice. But just in your mind, make sure you understand that that could be a problem, and that's something that you can optimize if you feel like, I need a better system. So, okay, these are the challenges. Oh, yeah.
One question. For example, when thinking of a process of, especially the step between, let's say, literature notes and permanent notes, let's say that you're reading a new source, and you found like certain ideas that are interesting and are related to maybe like other views of a similar topic in a different source, that you already have some like permanent notes related with, but as you're reading that source, that won't be like the only thing mentioned there, so you have some kind of fleeting / literature note depending on where you are exactly, but then you'll have some permanent notes that will need to be changed because your knowledge has in a sense been updated by those bits. But when do you break the workflow in the sense that, like, because many times, for example, like specific examples, I'm reading a paper and I find like one bit like that I'm like, oh, this particular, I don't know, like a mention of a technique or something specific that I've done and I've seen it in other papers, and for some reason it's interesting to me. Like, when do you decide, like, oh, do I stop the flow of scanning, let's say, this source to update the rest of my knowledge, or do I leave this, but then that means, yeah, having a kind of extra scaffolding in place so that you can revisit that, so that you can actually update what you were thinking, in the sense that thought starts like diverging, like you've got like multiple paths like splitting on each like time point.
So the question is, I'm exploring one piece of material and it's sparking ideas to branch off and explore something else. What do I do? Do I continue with my original goal, or do I branch off? I'll never tell you what to do, but what I would do in that situation, if I'm disciplined, because if I'm interested, I will probably follow the rabbit. But if I was disciplined, I would make enough of a note for future me to go follow that rabbit hole and where that leads to. And you're thinking of it as a workflow. That becomes like in your inbox of things to look at when you want to pick up. It's probably a good discipline, like if you're reading an article and you don't get to the end of the article because it's linked to something else, and suddenly you've got 5 tabs open and you're like, how did I get here? Like, you're sort of following without purpose in that sense. And you have to make the call. Is this a viable, like, have I gone too far? Do I need to step back? Is this more important than what I was doing originally that has now sparked something that's worth doing? You make that priority call. You can't do 2 things at once. If you want, there's probably more value completing one thing than not completing 10 things in that sense. But I would use the workflow to make fleeting notes that you've had this idea, maybe where that idea can be found for future you, and just put it as like on your backlog of next things to research, and then prioritize it against everything else. The important thing is that in that moment, that idea is really valuable. But when you read it later, you might be like, why did I have that idea? What was my thinking? You have to get enough of it down. Why that? Don't just put the link of something to look at, because you're looking at it. Why was that useful? You've lost that inspiration. Put something in your fleeting notes that say, this is what I want out of it, this is why, and you can get back to that state of inspiration, essentially. Or follow the rabbit hole, but just comes with caution that you'll be off track and sort of like meandering around that research. Okay, I'm going to move into the kind of questions that I've had asked. Maybe this will fit some of the. Maybe you don't know you've got this question yet because it's all like, wow. So I picked these. We'll go through them in turn. So I won't read them out. We'll just start. The first one. How do I make atomic notes? This is one that comes up like when I'm reading a book. I'm just capturing what they're saying. How do I make that atomic? Or mathematics are difficult. There's so many formulas and things like that, principles that you need to capture. You feel like it's just mostly copy and paste, or like it's really hard. So let's think about that. So you've got these fleeting notes, and ignore the examples. This was ChatGPT. Just give me something to display. I have no idea. Like, if you're laughing, then I know that it's not right. but good. That's fine. It's fine because I'm teaching the parameters around it. So you might have these fleeting notes. You just as much or as little as you need to understand what it is. So you might use, I call this the outline method, just bullet points. You just indent them as it's a subpoint, and you can go to any other indents. You might like doing diagrams, you might, I don't know, whatever works for you in terms of capturing that you can move on. What you're really doing is you're filtering that material down to the things that are really important and removing all the fluff, essentially. So that could be a fleeting note, and then you might have sub-fleeting notes on the sub-points. So you're making these sort of atomically. So now that you could go and create those literature notes in that more narrow area, so you've sort of sectioned off bits of thinking, and that helps you prioritize, what's most important to capture if you're stuck with time. And you might just continue all these down. So personally, I'd say just use your normal note-taking techniques to capture that, because what you're doing is you're comprehending and you're filtering what you're reading or what you're learning. And really, the quicker that you can use your techniques, the better, because then you can get through more material. So if you like doing an outline, great. If you like doing the Cornell method, great. If you want to do a mind map, great. Do what you want. Probably wouldn't just like copy and paste, because you're not putting it through your own thinking. You've got to think about what you're writing down. If you just copy and paste, it's a filtering in a way, but I find rewriting things helps my understanding, because it sparks some of those ideas. So then you want to take those and you want to put them in literature notes. So that's where you start fleshing it out. And you want to keep it atomic, so that what you said in the title of the note is delivered in the body of the note, nothing more, nothing less, in theory. So that I could pull that out and it makes sense. So atomic notes of each key idea. When the idea is a different idea that you may want to put into a different context, that's a new note. If you find that you're sort of explaining some of the principles that build on that idea, then maybe that's just siphoned off into a separate note, link it in, so you're keeping it atomic. Write it in your own words, because that is how you understand, not someone else's words, your words. And then, write it as though you explain it to someone else. If you want, test it on someone else and see if they understand it, because future you is not you. It is a different version of you who will have a different level of understanding and comprehension, and depending on how much sleep you've had, recall. So make your life easy. And write it simply. So Don't be fancy with your words. Make it easy to read and comprehend. Then you want to link these notes together. So in Obsidian, I call them wiki links, where you use the double square brackets. It's a markdown thing. We'll cover that later. But you can actually put links in the body of the text, or you can just put them at the end if you want to just talk about it, but you want to know where that launch pad is to the other things if you want to go back to it. Or you can put them in. Personal preference, up to you. So you can do the inline links or what I call reference links, so you're putting it at the bottom. And that's how you can create lots of things and sort of get that continuation and just sort of keep the notes atomic. It's almost like every paragraph in what would have been a long form note could be an atomic note, and you're just linking it all together in something that's bigger.
Sorry,
Yeah.
if I can interrupt you. So what you link there is another. Okay.
Yeah. So you've created this other note, and now you've got a relationship between the two things. And yeah, there's no limit to the number of notes you can create. I'll go into later when to create links and when not to, essentially. Yeah. We have a concept of backlinks. So Obsidian has, I think, a tab for backlinks. That means I can look at this and see what's linked to it. And that can be quite useful for knowing. So I've got a principle, for example, where have I used that and referenced that, and I can go and see those backlinks to where I've used it. So yeah, your literature notes are in the context of the source material. So you're not really thinking too much about your Zettelkasten. You don't want to be influenced too much, because you've got to understand what this author is saying. So you have to sort of step into the mind and not go in with any biases about what you've already read. You want to look at it in isolation and take it at its face value. But when you get your permanent notes, that's when you start saying, was this correct? Is this useful? Does this extend my knowledge? So the permanent notes are in the context of your understanding. So the first part is I'm understanding the author's position. Now I'm understanding my position and building on that. So in a concept, the permanent notes are just like literature notes. They're written in the same way. They link in the same way, just the links go further beyond that source materials kind of notes. And they're in the context of the whole Zettelkasten. So we've got 90,000 notes. You're, in theory, considering any one of those 90,000 notes could relate to what I just put in here. Hopefully with some clever tagging and thinking of how you structure it, you wouldn't have to go through 90,000 notes to find out what links to what. Okay, so that's what I mean by atomic notes. Just break it down into building blocks and then you can link them together. Okay.
Martin, I have an observation, at least the way I'm thinking about it. I try and put into every atomic note the objective I think I'm going to be able to use that note for. It's not just, at least the way I'm doing it, I don't just try and capture an idea. I try and capture an idea within the context of what my overall objective is. And that may change over time, but I think I have some point on the horizon that I'm navigating to. And I'm collecting up things I think that can help me get to, that. Where that point on the horizon I think is a paper or a thesis topic, or the thesis actually.
Yeah.
And so I just try and make sure that I get it into the atomic note, because later on when I look back at that, why did I write this down?
That's a good point, because otherwise, yeah, if you've got a direction you want to take it, you need to organize it somewhere. You can't just consider any one of these could be useful. But in the moment, you're finding the notes that are useful, and that you want to capture that.
I think I'm always kind of like juggling a bunch of things that I think have the probability to become something, but I don't know yet. And it's this process of doing research and then thinking about it that generates idea. Oh, yeah, maybe this will help me
Yeah.
on my way. And that's how I decide whether I'm going to make a note or not. Because it's not just that I understood something, but that I understood how it fits into where I think I'm going.
Yeah. So there's different ways you can approach that, which is, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. You can put the links in, references, you could put they're your notes. You can annotate the motivation of why you think that's important. You could have a note that is just, we'll cover it in a moment, just an outline of all the things that relate to that objective and add it into there so you've got the backlinks that kind of do it. So yeah, there's multiple ways of doing that, but the important thing is, and I think is completely valid, is you are making notes with some kind of goal. Catch the goal at the moment, because it'll save you that loss of direction when you come to, right, now I want to execute on that goal, where are my notes? And then you're left kind of back siphoning, sifting through everything.
I use the exact same thinking to decide what's too granular. So just getting back to Giannis's question about, do I go all the way back to first principles? I don't, because basically I don't need any help to remember Newton's laws or Maxwell's equations. Those are just like some foundational layer that I don't need to go any further, deeper and re-explain that stuff.
Yeah, and it's the point of
At least
diminishing
for me,
returns.
because
isn't it?
I'm writing them for me, okay? So I know what I know, fundamentally know, and I'm building on top of that.
Yeah. So how do you know what to link? So we've sort of touched on it a little bit. So this is where I kind of do a do's and don'ts list. It's by no means the definitive answer, but you want to link these things together. So I would say link it when it adds to your understanding. So a note in isolation, but in the context and other thing, helps you comprehend it even bigger, even better. So yeah, put a link in so that when you look at it later, you can follow that back through. When the concepts are really strongly related, so it could be that kind of continuation or sequence of notes, you want to kind of do that so that you don't have to go back and ask questions like, I understand the note, but I need to get back to that first principle, for example. And when you want to pose an idea or a question, it's a good time to maybe link it in. So you've got a note, it makes sense, but there's something niggling about it. It's not complete in your head. It's sparked something. So make a note. So when you look at it later, you can follow that train of thought again. But when I'd say don't make links, don't link every keyword. It'll be overload. Don't make a link if you can't really explain the reason why you've linked it. Otherwise, maybe you're doing the first thing, maybe you're just linking every keyword, for example, or you get overexcited, you think, I can put links in, this can link to that, and you realise that actually they're not that useful because the backlink maybe would have been good enough, or the search would have been good enough to collate these things together. It's got to be the understanding, not necessarily just related concepts that have to be linked together. And I would also say not to automate link generation. It's really interesting, sort of in the note-taking space in software, where there's hints at using AI to help you with your thinking, and maybe there's a value in that. I think I'm on the fence really, because maybe as suggestions could be useful, but if you're using the machine to do your thinking, you're not doing your thinking, and it's as good as a fellow student having written all the notes, and you're expecting to get all that understanding via osmosis. It doesn't happen. So carefully considered links that mean something to you is more valuable than just scattergun approach of linking everything to everything. So before I move on, any more questions, observations about linking in particular? I think my take on it is quite individual. You'll have to sort of get a feel for what is relevant to you, what's not. Just don't do too much, because in your graph you will look like everything's connected to everything. You can't see the clusters, for example. Another one, how do I title my notes? Comes up every so often. So really, the title will be valuable as you start linking things and searching. That will be the first thing that you see. So it should explain what the note is about. Don't be fancy. Don't use terms that are hard to actually understand what it's going to explain when you open that note. So don't clickbait yourself, basically. That's what I say. Try and avoid titles that have multiple things, because maybe that's 2 atomic notes. So an example there, it just might suggest, if it's like, machine learning techniques and the consequence on society, like maybe that's 2 notes, whatever. So if you find yourself joining 2 concepts together in the title, then maybe you haven't made them atomic enough, or you haven't written it simply enough. You might use conversational titles. So if you're doing inline links, you might just want to have a flow of text and link it out there. So it could be the best way to detect a user's pose in VR, for example. Maybe that's how you like to talk to yourself, so you know what you're looking for. And when you pose an idea or a question, so an idea might be user pose detection in VR, so you can kind of see the difference when it's like, what is the, it's more conversational rather than just a title. But really there's no right or wrong way. If you do use inline links in Obsidian, you can actually change it so it's more conversational, but it links to something that's maybe title case, for example, that would look odd as you're reading it out. So there are ways of doing that. But naming them is quite important. You might be thinking, looks really chaotic if you're something like super organized, folders for everything. The graph view can look really chaotic. How do I find things like, the question, 90,000 nodes, how useful is that? That's as good as not very useful because it's very chaotic. So you've got to think about how you organize your Zettelkasten. So here are some things. You can use hashtags to categorize things. So if it fits a theme and you want to be able to find your notes on a particular theme, just use hashtags. You can create what's called a map of content. So it's like an entry file, like a table of contents, that allows you to link notes in. And I'll give more of an example of that in a moment. And the way I like to think of it is, don't think of it as a collection of notes, but think of it like a database that you can query your notes in different contexts. So it's the same note, but in different places. Map of contents, linked here, linked there. So, and Obsidian even has a way to do that, which is pretty cool. So but try not to create folders for everything. If you're, you want to create a folder for all things you've observed about cars, and then, I'm trying to think of an example here, and then suddenly you've got a vehicle that is a boat car, but you've got another folder for boats. Which one does the boat car go in? So the moment you do folders, it's really hard to fit things in the right folder, especially when you're trying to join stuff together and find things that haven't been categorized in a particular way. Try not to over-tag things, because the more noise you put in, the harder it is to get meaning out of it. And then, maps of content. So these are quite nice. You can just create potentially a folder of these things that allow you to have kind of top-level entry points in, and then just link to the sections that allow you to quickly find where your notes are on a particular subject. So hopefully that's like a hierarchy down to narrowing down to where you want. And the cool thing about that is, it acts as an entry point to a given topic. So it's just a simple outline to all the notes of that given topic. So if you're creating a project, you could start with a map of content of all the things that you want to cover, and then that is your starting point for maybe filling it out into writing your article. And they just link to the individual notes there. The important thing is it's just completely fluid. You can do this however you want. There's no There's no right or wrong way, and you can do it organically. You can add this in at any point if you find that another technique wasn't working for you. And you can create as many as you want. So not just one map of content. And those notes can appear in multiple maps of content, so they're not one-time use notes, which is really nice. And if you really want to be advanced, maybe create a map of content, it's up to you. So that's how I think about organizing, is you think of it as a database and you're just creating these kind of views into that data with maps of content, with tags, and all of that. But you might be thinking, I've got 90,000 notes, how do I find anything in this mess? Use maps of content is a nice way. Just covered that. If you're using Obsidian, for example, just use the search bar. So you can go by keyword, by title, tags, path, probably not as useful. If you have certain ways that you would recall something, you can put just a section in your notes saying keywords or search terms, so that this will find it when you say those words. I do that with email myself. Like sometimes I'll send myself an email that I know I'll refer to in a year, but I'll put what I would search for to find that email. So I'm paying dividends forward to future Martin. So you can basically do it based on keyword. Tags, so in Obsidian specifically, there's a tag view, so you can go and view them. Really straightforward. It might be on by default, the new versions, but it didn't used to be, so you can turn that on. You have to think of your notes as a way to search. So you might have an entry point of a note that allows you to discover where that leads to. So if you remember the algorithm, you can't remember what it was called, but you knew you referenced it in another note, then hopefully you've linked it in as a way to discover it there. You've got the graph view, so that is the actual graph view in Obsidian. So that's kind of what it looks like, so you can highlight around. And you also get a local graph view as well, so you can take one note and just see what branches off that note. It's quite cool. And then when you think of your notes as a database, there's a plugin for Obsidian, which we'll hopefully get time to cover, where you can actually query for notes of certain properties and create dynamic views. So you don't have to go update maps of content. You can have it done automatically. So what do I mean by thinking? Right? This thing's inorganic, you can't think. What does that mean? So you may think of your notes only exist in the context of you researching, but one of the real powers is actually don't have an objective to research material, but just look at your Zettelkasten. And this is what Nicholas Lehman would do. He would go through as a separate task, as a separate workflow, and just explore what he's got in there and what thinking he can do about that. So spend time with it as you're trying to ideate ideas or upgrade your thinking. Once you've got enough notes, you've got enough to work with there. And then you want to consider those gaps, those ideas, what connections can be made, and then use your writing to develop your thinking. So you're trying to answer the questions. How do you perceive this problem that needs solving? What's your approach to it? And that helps you kind of organize your own thoughts. And if something's confusing or conflicting, use writing to resolve that. And once you've done that, add it back in. You're capturing that now. So, it's a nice way to capture your thoughts as you go through and upgrade them, essentially. Citations. So, like you're reading material, how do you make sure that you cite it correctly in that? Am I right in thinking you all use Zotero, or is that? I've not used it before. I had to play with it. It's really confusing. But I think I've figured enough to give you a pointer here. So what I would do is add references section. So if the thinking is derived from something that I've read and I want to reference it, that I need to carry that forward, you can just add it at the bottom of that note, which is quite nice. Or you can create a citation note and link to it. So you do it once, and then if you have multiple times you want to cite it, then you've got it done once, which is quite nice. And you can look at the back references of every time you've used that citation, which is quite nice. So, for example, that could link to a citation note, just a little bit that you've extracted and where it came from. So, yeah. Do not comment on whether that is a correct way of referencing, because ChatGPT gave that for me. Yeah, and then you can see every time you've used that reference, which is quite a nice way to keep track of your source material. And if you want to use Zotero, I did have a play. There is a plugin to Obsidian. Once you install that plugin and you use the command palette, you can go import notes from Zotero. It brings up a dialog where you can go and look for the thing. This sound like I just call it thing that you want to import them for, and then it will actually just insert it in that note. And the cool thing is, it gives you a link back to Zotero, so you can click the link and it'll open Zotero to that point. So hopefully that's enough to guide you of the possibilities, because I do not know any more than that. So yeah. And then, what do I mean by projects? I like the word projects because for me, it could be a YouTube video, or it could be a newsletter article, or a blog post, or something like that. For you, it would be something a bit more substantial with research and all that. But these are essentially the things that you create. So they could be the articles, or they could be the papers, or they could be the journals, or they could be videos if you want to create a video on a particular subject. It could be a report. A prototype as well. What do you need to do a prototype? And it can be ultimately your thesis. So you can think of, to start with that, hopefully you can assemble it from all your thinking and all your research and all your understanding from your Zettelkasten, and that bit becomes more of a construction job rather than a design job.
Regarding the projects, how do you, so you've got the pieces, and let's say that you're putting them together for something, but at least in the, I think in the context of the research of most of us here, like normally you won't have, let's say, all the bits in atomic notes, because some of them would be just like numbers and tables and just like results from an experiment. So when you do a project, how do you reflect what pieces belong to that project? Because obviously it cannot be like fully exclusive, because you may reduce some part for another project, but like on the other hand, you normally want some kind of idea of like, yeah, these are all the things that I need to get for this project.
I like to think of this very simply. If you were sat in front of me and say, I got this research and I got this project, this research kind of has bits that aren't relevant to the project, but I want to take part of it. I'd ask you, well, which part relates to this project? And you'd explain that to me. And I said, that's a note. And then you can link that note into your project, and that note links to the wider research or the results. Or it could be a GitHub kind of repository, for example, where you've got your prototype. You can use notes to, well, you can either embed things in the note. So if it's a PDF, for example, that you produce a report, you can put it in the note. In Obsidian, it'll put it in your vault and out there. And then you can create notes off that for the bits that you want to articulate are useful. And that could be the thing you link to your project. So while I may not answer your question specifically, the model of which I think about it is, if you are able to produce a report, a project that can articulate the little thing that is of relevance to that project, that is derived from a bigger thing, then a note can articulate why that little thing came from that big thing. And that's the thing you kind of, you might be doing that in the project. So you've got all these results, for example, and you're like, right, now I need to do the bit that sifts the relevant kind of bit out of it. And that could be a small note that you link in, or you might be tempted to just put it straight in the report. There's no right or wrong answer, but your notes can be metadata about something external as well. That captures the essence, so that it's like atomic in the sense I understand what that means in the results that I can link in. That's how I would kind of think about that. Does that help? I don't know.
Yeah, at least for what I understand, it will be basically to create, let's say, like an intermediate step where you've got whatever it is. Well, you've got the wider source material, then you've got your condensed own knowledge of it, and then you've got like a link that extracts part of that knowledge, and those links in the form of atomic nodes are then what actually constitute the project.
Yeah.
The intermediate step. Okay.
Yeah. It's the externalization of your thinking. Like if you've got these results and in your head you know what bit is relevant, that could be the note that you put in there. And you do that thinking once and have to sift through it. So yeah, this is the sort of end of the Zettelkasten bit.